Excellent start to the day, a little positivity mixed with a dose of reality in terms of where we are and the future ahead. Always great to be here. Met the organisers late last night. I was at a gig in Dublin, so I was late down, but nevertheless the organisers were here to welcome me. It was after 2 o'clock, but they were in their positive mood here to make sure I got here, and I was even offered a drink. It wasn't milk, Jim, now, but and one of the organisers was swaying from side to side, but nevertheless I got offered a drink at 2 o'clock in the morning. Anyway, let's get down to business. Okay, the first session I think has put a lot of the issues that we face in context in terms of the reality around milk price, volatility, etc., and that kind of thing, and the whole piece around the environment and the nitrates and the organic derogation, etc. For our overseas visitors, like, just to maybe a little bit of context, I think, before we get into the piece around the two papers. We have two excellent papers coming up here, and a bit of a discussion around that whole piece around stocking rate and where we're going to go for the future. For the last, give or take, 20 years, Ireland has been operating at, give or take, 250 kilos of organic nitrogen per hectare. So that was the stocking rate. So a cow was producing 85 kilos of organic nitrogen. Divided by the 250, you get your kind of 2.9 cows per hectare, give or take. That was the system we were operating on. And I suppose in the last 2 or 3 years, there's been a shift, a very significant shift this year, because that 250 is now down to 220. And a cow is now producing, the average cow is now producing 92 kilos of organic nitrogen or slurry or nutrients. So hence the stocking rate, the legal stocking rate that farmers can operate at has tightened down. And as Aidan suggested in the question, there's a possibility that 170, and Jim alluded to it, the possibility of 170, that would be limited to 170 in the not too distant future, depending on what measures and parameters and water quality that farmers are operating under. So 220 divided by 92 is bringing us back to 2.4 cows per hectare. And if you go for a high yielding cow, they're producing, give or take, 106 kilos of organic nitrogen. So you're down to 2.1 cows per hectare as your maximum stocking rate on farms. That compares across the water to, even if you're in a nitrate vulnerable zone across the water, you can stock up to 250 and you can spread up to 300 kilos of bagged nitrogen. We're at 225 as a maximum now of bagged nitrogen. So worlds apart in terms of the options or the ability to produce milk from grass. So the question then is, what happens at farm level? Do farmers stock up and produce a higher producing cow and a higher input to try and deliver Jim the milk that they've been producing for the last, whether it's 500,000 litres or 1 million litres, do they try and continue to do that for Jim? Or do they reduce their milk supply per farm because of this stocking rate piece? So that's some of the context around what this next session is about. So we have two excellent presentations. First, we're going to have Dr. Brendan Horn from Moorpark to talk about, I suppose, the grass-based system, the Moorpark system that we've been following for the last number of years. Dr. Lawrence Shillou is in the audience with us as well. Both have been working on this paper and continuously work on this in this topic and have been for the last 20, 30, 40 years in terms of examining farm systems of the future. After that, we'll have UCD and the higher input type system, the higher output type system, and then we'll have a discussion on how they both fit into the system so that the dairy industry, as typified by Jim Bergen, can continue into the future. So, Brendan, I'll leave the floor is yours to take up the first session in terms of examining farm systems of the future.
Thanks, Jack. Good morning, everyone. First of all, just a thank you to the organisers for the opportunity to present this morning. I'm particularly looking forward to this session because, like any good dairy farm, we have a very clear division of responsibility here between myself and Lawrence in terms of the Teagasc piece. I'm going to give the presentation and he's going to deal with all the big hairy questions at the end. So I'm going to sit down and relax. So I'm encouraging vigorous discussion and as many colourful questions as possible at the end of the session. I look forward to that. So I guess, somebody got the, oh yeah, sorry. Just, I suppose in terms of what we're going to do over the next 20 or so minutes, we're going to just begin in context, and Jim has outlined that very well in terms of the sector. But from a farming perspective, that context I think is important. Then we're going to look at some of the very recent important changes that have happened in terms of the real situation for a dairy farmer in terms of producing milk in a profitable way, family farm models and so on. And then we're going to look at some of the opportunities for the future. So look, I'm going to spend very little time on this, and it's been well covered. From a global farming perspective, I think it's important for our audience to realise that a lot of the challenges that we have faced in the very recent number of years are experienced by most dairy farmers. And fortunately, working in research, we're integrating a lot of international networks, and we can see a lot of these trends internationally. So, significant increases in farm gate costs have occurred globally. Okay, reduced margins, additional regulation, those are common themes, and they are stressing dairy farmers right around the world. Okay. Weather events and patterns and the challenges of managing that in terms of meeting animal requirements, productive, in particular grazing systems, is a common theme across those. Competition for resources for farmers. So not just in terms of land resources and opportunities for land use, which is now changing at a faster rate than previously, but also in terms of capital, in terms of labour. We're dealing with very tight labour markets. So there's lots of competition for resources. And now we can add on top of that competition for carbon. Competition for this new entity that has arisen in terms of, I suppose, our lives today, if you like. And then there's that growing expectation from consumers who are challenged in terms of our consumers, who are challenged in terms of the cost of living crisis and the inflation that has occurred, particularly in terms of food. So, look, those are the global themes. I guess from an Irish dairy industry team then, bringing it a little bit more closer to home, I mean, we've seen an unbelievable change in terms of value in recent years. A 33% increase in total value in the sector since 2017 alone, based on a 20% increase in milk output, but also massive technological progress on farms, and that vibrancy that we've got from being able to farm in a way that has allowed us to be both productive, efficient and develop our systems post-quota. It's been a pleasure to work and to experience that and the changes at farm level. As part of that, we've seen an accelerated adoption of climate-smart farming measures, and I've just listed two examples of it here. Jim talked about the sustainability requirements on farms and the actions needed. We've seen a 31% reduction in the use of chemical fertiliser within Irish agriculture between 2018 and 2022 alone. If I would think of the 140 measures in the Climate Action Plan, the National Plan for Climate Action, probably that's the only measure where we've actually exceeded the 2020-30 target already in the space of 3 to 4 years. It's phenomenal movement in terms of farm action towards these climate targets. Sex semen is another great one, and dealing with other pressures. You're seeing in terms of the Irish industry, we've gone from 80 to 280,000 doses during that period. So an acknowledgement of the need to bring value through the sector in terms of beef and so on. 30% of dairy and Sims are now in terms of sex semen. It's a phenomenal change in a short space of time. So don't tell me that farmers aren't aware of the issues and moving quickly to address those issues. And then I suppose in terms of pragmatism and policy and so on, to support that, to ensure that we have a vibrant sector. This is an €8 billion sector in Ireland. Okay, it's about a third of our corporate tax take in value terms alone. It's a huge indigenous supplier, and and in a complex situation, and needs time and space to deal with some of these issues. And we have to acknowledge also some of the things that are happening in terms of at farm level that we need to address and be careful about. So, look, in particular in terms of this session, increased concentrate supplementation has become a theme in recent years. We're steadily increasing the amount of concentrate used within our grazing systems. And at the same time, we're seeing reductions in pasture production. Some of that off of climate stresses, I guess, and some of it off of, I think, in some ways, poor implementation of grazing practices. And that's going to be one of the themes in terms of this presentation. And I think the other context point to pick up on that you mentioned is the need to create extra value from the sector as an outward sector, exporting sector for the future. And some of those themes are going to be here in terms of ensuring that farms are profitable into the future, okay, and that we can build that profitability and increase the profitability of dairy farming over the next decade. That we can increase the efficiencies. And what I mean by that, and it sounds vague, is that we continue to build on doing the basics of being a good grazing dairy farmer build on that, do it better than we do it today. And to me, that will solve both the economic and also some of the sustainability questions that we have. I think in terms of teams and value from milk produced from these islands in terms of milk production, I think reducing our use of inputs and reducing the impacts of resources that we use is critically important, and that's kind of built into the policy framework. And then building in the extra value that's required by customers now. So I'm thinking there in terms of carbon storage, bringing more biodiversity. So those are the grand themes that I think can contribute to make farms more profitable and also deliver more value in terms of for the sector, for customers in the future. And in terms of the model, this is always in our minds in terms of how we do this. The implementation of this grazing model that has served grassland farmers very, very well over the last decade. That we calve cows compactly at the start of the grass growing season, we maximise grass production, grass quality, to yield a high level of productivity from that system, and do that in a very, very efficient, labour efficient, environmentally sustainable way. And I think in terms of the discussion and the thing we're talking about today, sometimes you can fall into the trap of thinking about that in very linear terms or binary terms, just about concentrate. But a well-managed grazing system involves excellent genetics, excellent grassland management, decision making, and then a whole load of labour efficient and environmental policies and practices as well on top of that. And I think what we're going to see in this session is actually that a lot of those practices are common to the two systems that we're going to look at. And that's really, really important that you take away from that that's very high level of implementation of a well-run grazing system here in all of these systems. And that's the bedrock in terms of profitable dairying. That system has served us very, very well. And if you look at international studies and recent international studies which have compared Ireland pre-quota to post-quota and compared us with other EU partners, so the Danes, the Germans, the French, indeed the Dutch, you'll see that, Irish farmers have actually increased their margin, profitable margin, during the last decade because of the grazing systems that we've implemented. And we have made fantastic progress in terms of doing that. And I guess, look, that has allowed us to drive down costs in general over that period. Now we're facing a new challenge where we've seen a step up in terms of costs for reasons outside of the farm gate. And it's a question then about, well, what do we need to do now, I suppose, to contend with that change? I put up a huge number of numbers here, but I think you're familiar with all of them for the most part in terms of grazing. And these are the key performance indicators for a well-run dairy farm. I'm showing you the average values of dairy farms over the last 3 to 4 years, the most profitable dairy farmers, what they're doing, and then target values. And invariably what that means is the best genetics applied in a compact seasonal grazing system in terms of stocking rate, appropriate stocking rate, high levels of pasture utilisation, lower levels of supplementary feed usage, higher levels of or reduced chemical fertilizer use, a mature grazing dairy herd with a high level of fertility, achieving very high levels of profitability, low environmental footprint in terms of carbon or in terms of nutrient losses and so on. So that has been the model. But equally, I think it's important, and I'm not going to dwell on that, is to question, well, if there's been a lot of change in the short term, so in terms of, I suppose, stocking rate limits, in terms of capex requirements now for farms, in terms of reduced fertilizer availability and heading towards 200 kilos of nitrogen, per hectare allowances in the future, has it dated well? Do we need to change? What do we need to change in order to ensure that we continue on the path of more profitable and sustainable dairying for the future? And to me, that's really the question in terms of this session. So to begin then, we have to start, well, what's changed? What are the key fundamentals that have changed? And for everyone here, I guess the first one is costs of production. 2020-23, a lot of farm groups now are going to be meeting over the next few weeks. Indeed, some have met already. And when they review 2023 as a year, what they will come to in conclusion is that it probably represents one of the highest milk prices that they will have received in the last decade, the last 15, 20 years, in fact. But margins on dairy farms have reduced. So 2023 will probably look more like a 2018 in terms of cost, in terms of margin. It'll certainly be on the lower end of that decadal pattern. So something else has changed. The costs have gone up, and probably, I think, on reflection, a lot of those farms will be disappointed with what the economic return has been achieved on dairy farms in 2023. And it's about then, well, what do we do about that? So the reasons for that are simple. We can often think about the year in terms of how good milk price was or how bad milk price was. But in actual fact, we've seen a step change in terms of costs. That mean that it's actually the margin that has changed, not so much the milk price. This is from the Outlook conference, this graphic on the left-hand side here, and it just shows you in 2022, which is the last full year of data that's been produced, feed costs have gone up by about a third. Actually, if you add in 23, they've gone up by about 40%. Pasture and forage, so that's the fertilizer, the feed, the reseeding, all those costs have gone up by about 80%. So the underlying cost of managing grazing has increased. Energy obviously is up by about 30, 40%. Some of that is coming back down now. And all costs, all the other costs have also increased. So the graph on the right-hand side of that graphic there just shows you in either cent per litre terms on the left or in terms of cost per kilo milk solids on the right. The huge change has occurred in a short space of time on farms in terms of cost of production. We've gone from around that 25, 26 cent a litre full cost to now 2 years of 35, 36 cent a litre costs on farms. So that's a huge change. That's a massive, massive problem. And one that, and what can we do about it as farmers? What can we do to address that and make sure that we can realise value in terms of profitable family farms for the future? When you break that down then and start looking at the component costs and the controllable costs, one of the big ones that sticks out for me is feed costs. Feed costs, if you include 2023, have increased by about 54% on Irish farms. Some of that is a measure of the increased use levels as well as the actual cost per tonne, if you like. And I think this graphic is important to consider in terms of the relative costs of various feed alternatives that farmers can use. So here we have what the costs of grazed grass or grass with clover included in it were in the blue bars in 2013 and what they are now today in 2023 or 2024. So that cost has gone up. It's gone up from about €7 a kilo or €70 a tonne of dry matter to about €100 a tonne of dry matter. It has increased as we've expected. Fertiliser, machinery, contractor, all our costs have gone up and that's to be expected. But the point I want to make is that if you compare it with the alternative feeds, and I've just showed the simple ones here, the silage is in the middle, pit and bale silage, and probably the most easy feed one, which is purchased concentrate. If you compare them with those, the actual inflation in those has actually been a much higher magnitude. So the slope of the line in terms of the relative costs of these alternative feed sources for milk production has got much more steep. So concentrates in 2023, for example, to take it at the most extreme form, it's now 5 times the cost of grazed grass. It's at around, it's at a record high of around €450 a tonne. It's coming back a little bit from that, but nonetheless, it has become increasingly unaffordable to use these feeds in grazing systems. Such has been the cost increases that have occurred. Can I put that in other terms? For the average dairy farmer today, compared to 10 years ago, we've doubled the amount of money we're spending on feed and fertiliser on our farms in cent per litre terms. Okay, it's a massive, massive explosion in terms of a cost, and some of that is a controllable cost and an area where we can work on. So this has happened, and it's a question of then, well, what can we do about it? And to try and bring a bit more kind of understanding to those changes then, I've just looked at National Farm Survey data during the last decade to try and say, well, why is some of that happening? At farm level, we've seen an increase in the productivity of animals. We were producing 350 kilos of milk solids based on national data in 2012. In 2022, we've added 90 kilos of milk solids a cow. So more productive, higher EBI, more efficient animals. Concentrate usage, as I've already said, has stepped up. Okay, so we've gone from, we were never at 500 kilos. As an industry, 10 years ago, we were at about 700, 800, 900 kilos. Now it's routinely a tonne to 1.3 tonnes of concentrate fed per cow. So that is a shift in terms of practice. Just at a very crude level, to show you, like milk solids per kilo of concentrate fed on farms, a very crude measure of the efficiency of that concentrate use on a cow basis. You can see that it's no more efficient today than it was 10 years ago to use supplements. We haven't got any better at using them. In terms of 350 kilos of milk solids using 990 kilos of concentrate versus 440 at 1246, it's no better a story than it was 10 years ago in terms of we haven't done anything better than we were doing previously. One massive change that has occurred is farmers have stepped up milking platform stocking rates to utilise more grass on farms. And that's a massive shift as well. From 2 livestock units per hectare a decade ago, it's up to 2.7 today. And I suppose in contrast to that, and here's the big stick, I guess, in all of this. When we look at pasture-based data in terms of grass production on farms that measure grass routinely, more than 30 covers a year, grass production hasn't increased at all. If anything, in the last 5 years, grass production has declined on dairy farms from reasons of, weather and so on as well. So, look, acknowledging some of those challenges, but we've increased stocking rates, grass production hasn't lifted in order to feed that feed gap, and we're using more concentrate in our system as part of that. And I think that's something that we need to think about, because that whole stocking rate question has to come back into bearing then when you start talking about that. What we know in terms of profitability, and looking at extensive data sets like this joint Teagasc UCD study from, looked at the period from 2008 to 2015, was it's very clear what the factors are that influence the profitability of grazing dairy farms. In particular, you're talking about extra grass utilisation. Farms that grow and utilise more grazed grass are the most profitable farms, regardless of any other criteria that you might use to judge those farms. And the value over that period was an extra €170 net profit per farm per hectare for every extra tonne of grass that's utilised. And it also corresponds to more grazing days. So an extra, as you increase grazing season length, that is also more profitable. And interestingly, looking at the presentations that are to come and the conference proceedings, you're going to see over the next 2 days that theme reinforced when you look at other countries as well, in terms of what are the factors that drive profitability from grazing systems internationally. The evidence in terms of farms is that when we increase the proportion of supplements we use in these grazing systems, we actually reduce profitability. So in terms of profit impacts, a 10% increase in purchase feed corresponds to €100 reduction in profit per hectare on farms, and an increase in cost of production, a significant increase in cost of production as well. So profits reducing and risk increasing. The risks around your business in a heightened cost environment increasing. So look, those are the real challenges, and that in no way and has never impeded that an individual farmer can use more supplements and do it very, very effectively. But what it says is, as an industry, when we look at our data, the evidence base, the challenges of increasing supplementation at grazing are significant, and invariably farmers struggle to make it work. In fact, it reduces their profitability. And I guess one of the reasons for that is that we know that when we increase concentrate feed or purchase feed use, it's not just feed costs that increase. Our evidence is that total costs increase by an order of magnitude of 1.2 to 1.6 times the increase in feed costs. So, you can think in terms of the marginal effect of putting in a bit more feed and the extra milk revenue that we might garner from that, but that really doesn't tell the story of the full cost, because there's costs there's labour, there's inefficiencies, there's facilities required to do that, and that can be considerably additional in terms of the cost. So, look, I guess the point is you are working against a tide. In terms of grazing system, using supplements and extra supplements, it is more challenging, it is more difficult. There are farmers who can do it, but as an industry, the evidence base for it is very, very poor. To focus though on where we are, and as farmers, the profitability impactors, well, the big one is grass utilisation, and this is the graphic from that same study where that €170 per hectare came out of. The nice thing about this was it covered all manner of cow types, all environments, all years, milk prices and so on. And this was the main factor that affected profitability in that study. 40% of the variation in profit was reflected by the amount of grass that was being utilised on farms. Okay, and it was very, very clear, key target for farmers to aim for. And just interestingly, at the end of last year, Joe Patton looked at the profit monitor data just for 2022, which is a uniquely different year in terms of milk price and in terms of the changes at farm level compared to that previous period. And he observed exactly the same importance to pasture utilisation in terms of 2022 data. If anything, the steepness of the curve in terms of the benefit of using extra pasture because of higher milk price, because of the unaffordability of other feeds, was substantially greater in 2022 and 23 than it has been heretofore. So again, I guess the return from better grazing, better pasture utilisation has never been better for dairy farmers. And I guess behind all of that, and we're talking about environmental indicators and so on as well, there's a question of stocking rate and the future, and stocking farms appropriately. And I put up this because Paul Bird is here from New Zealand, and I think it's probably the best representation of the importance of stocking rate I've ever heard. It's written 60 years ago, and it's just as applicable today as it was then. And it just shows you how, really, stocking rate is the key driver of everything we're talking about here. Have the wrong stocking rate, you're going to be using too much supplements, you're going to be inefficient in terms of grazing, you can't build cover in autumn, you shorten your grazing season. If too low a stocking rate, you can't use pasture, there's too much surpluses, quality deteriorates. It is by far and away the most important factor influencing the efficiency of grazing systems. And for a number of years now, even before quotas have gone, we have outlined for farmers using 500, 600 kilos of concentrate, what should be the target overall stocking rate for a system, and that it is highly linked to the amount of pasture that's grown on farm. And that for our database of farmers who are growing between 13 and 14 tonnes of dry matter per hectare per year, that's most dairy farmers that are measuring frequently, the overall farm stocking rate of around 2.4 cows per hectare applies that overall stocking rate. While also acknowledging with farmers that you could increase the milking platform stocking rate to 2.7, 2.8 and utilise the extra pasture that's produced through the middle of the curve as grazed grass in that setting, and bring in additional winter forage and so on from outside to offset that. So having the milking platform at 2.7, 2.8, the overall stocking rate at 2.4, for the very most part that was the target for farmers to allow them to achieve very high levels of productivity, high levels of profitability, and still based on 60% grazed grass in the diet and only 10% supplementary feed. And I just bringing that up to date then, I guess, in terms of the new organic end targets for farms. You can see the target for a band 2 cow, so for the international audience, an animal that is producing 6,000 kilos or less of milk per cow per year is allocated an organic end figure of 92 kilos today. That means an overall stocking rate of 2.4 at 220. So for farms appropriately stocked, for most farmers that were growing 13, 14 tonnes, that was probably at the limit of what was efficient in terms of grazing. But equally acknowledging there are farms there that can grow a lot more grass than that, where the economic return on grazing has been undermined by that already imposition of the 220 organic stocking rate. But the other point I want to make from this is then for those farms that go beyond that overall milking platform stocking rate, that shove the milking platforms much higher than this marginal level here that I've showed for extra pasture utilisation. We've described in this graph in terms of being in the red, because in that situation it's very similar to the grass-rich illustration that Positive Farmers produced many, many years ago, which shows that all the additional feed required at these stocking rates, where you're in excess of the grass potential of the farm, all of that extra feed is coming off farm. So now you're into all the high-cost feed alternatives. Now you're into all the additional costs in those systems. So really worrying kind of development. So look, it's about, as farmers, being pragmatic around stocking rate. What's the grass growth potential, and then how can we address it in terms of, I suppose, appropriately stocking the farm to maximise profitability. Just in terms of international evidence, exactly supports that same premise. And again, you'll see it in the proceedings, and look forward to seeing the presentations over the next 2 days. Increasing the proportion of supplemental feeds on farms in general has been damaging in terms of profitability, decreasing profitability, increasing cost of production, lots of detrimental impacts in terms of, I guess, the profitability of the dairy system as listed there, increasing milk production, but everything else was a negative impact. Okay, so, I suppose you are trying to work the oracle in terms of using other feeds in a grazing system. And this international study was just produced recently, and it just showed, I guess, what I liked about it was the proportion of grazed grass in the cow's diet. Looking at international evidence, in Ireland, the justification for going to higher levels of grazed grass in an animal's diet is actually greater than other countries, because our feed costs, the relative feed advantage of grazing is so much higher. So bring yourself up to 2023, grazing as more advantageous cost feed. Well, that also means that the proportion of grass in the animal's diet should increase in order to leverage extra profitability benefit from that. So driving down the cost of production to a greater extent. Is there a justification from a cow type point of view for higher levels of supplementation? Perhaps in the back of some minds it is the idea that, as we've built the genetic potential of the herd, we should feed more in order to meet that criteria. Well, the evidence from the next generation herd is that going from 300 kilos of concentrate to 1,200 kilos of concentrate, there's no difference in terms of milk solids response, which we're paid on, in terms of between elite and national average genetics. So there's no additional value for high genetic potential animals on higher levels of supplement in terms of efficiency. Indeed, in terms of feed restriction, there's also no effect, the beneficial effects of feed restriction and higher stocking rates. I mean, you don't see that between elite and national average just the same. And just to broaden out the discussion, I suppose, before I finish, I wanted to say, I mean, we're talking about the question of concentrate supplementation to me, which to me is very binary in terms of a factor to talk about. And if I think of the opportunities for feeding animals better in grazing systems, I think the return on investment from looking at incorporating clovers in our swards as an alternative focus, I think is far more rewarding. And there's been lots of evidence on that, showing us that even at relatively low clover proportions in our sward, we can lift animal performance, we can take out fertilisers out of the system, that there's massive savings and improvements in sustainability to be achieved from that. Bringing that data up to date for 2023 at current costs, at current prices, the economic return from having grass clover swards on our farms is that it will increase the profitability of our farms by €500 per hectare. I mean, it's a massive, by comparison, a massive opportunity for dairy farmers. Grazing, I would say, at the root of some of our issues and some of our reliance on increased concentrate supplementation is a lack of implementation of good grazing. I haven't time to go through the 6 characteristics here, but suffice to tell you that if you look at those 6 criteria, all things I think we can all commonly agree are important artefacts of being a good grassland farmer. Today, only about 5% of farmers in this room could stand up and say they match all 6 of those. So the challenge is to better implement the system that we have. And as part of that, for me, it's about reducing concentrate fertiliser or concentrate feed use. So from that national average figure of 1,250 today, where can we remove concentrate from the system by better quality swards as an industry strategy? It's taking it out in mid-season, I guess, in the first instance, and then, I suppose, better feed budgeting and so on, better measurement to utilise more concentrate, to use less concentrate and more pasture in animal diets and achieve higher performance looking ahead. To summarise, Mr. Chairman, in terms of looking at that model for the next 10 years, in light of the cost inflation, the requirements of sustainability at farms, I don't see any reason for change in terms of the direction of travel at the moment, just better implementation of the system that we have today. That system will continue to be based on lower levels of concentrate supplementation and better implementation of better genetics, more compact calving, clover in our swards and better grazing management practices. And that, it's important to say, will yield much better profitability levels on all dairy farms, even in spite of the challenges that we face. So that's instrumental. To summarise, we've seen significant cost inflation at farm level. We have to control the controllables. We have to get on top of this now and quickly on farms. And at the start of 2024, I'd urge everyone, if you haven't already done so, to complete a financial appraisal of 2023 and look at those cost base, how has it changed and what can you do about it. For me, improved grazing, appropriate stocking rates, compact calving, continue to build in that genetic base, that will be the avenue at which you'll manage these extra costs, bring them back down, and we've seen the evidence of that. Farmers who have continued on this path, they've suffered the least inflation in terms of costs. The range in terms of increase in costs is frightening between farms, depending on the actions that they've already taken. And that, I guess, is the basis for looking ahead positively that we can be more profitable while meeting these criteria in the future and contributing to that climate-smart dairy economy in the future. So I'll leave it at that, Jack. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Brendan. Top class and lots of information, and obviously Brendan could have spent a lot more time at that presentation, but it's better to leave a little bit of a chat for a bit of time for the discussion afterwards, and for, as Brendan says, for Lawrence to answer the hard questions. Next up, I suppose to counter that discussion around more feed, I want to invite 2 speakers, Zoe McKay and Michael Wallace from University College Dublin. This is a double act, so Zoe is going to come first and present some of her slides in terms of, Zoe is the grassland lecturer at UCD, and Michael is the Professor of Agriculture at UCD and the Professor of Economics at UCD. So they have a research farm, Lyons Research Farm, just outside Dublin, where they have a trial ongoing. Zoe's going to tell us more about it, but effectively they're putting in more feed to get more output, more purchase feed going in to get more output. So obviously it's a systems trial, one particular trial and one particular farm, to condition all that and the assumptions assumed, etc. But Zoe, you're going to describe some of that, and then Michael is going to come and have a little bit of discussion around the sums. Over to you, Zoe.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you very much for just the opportunity to share with you some of the research that's been going on at UCD Lyons Farm for the last 8 years. And I think, as it's been outlined already, and as Brendan has kind of set up, Ireland is a very grass-focused system, and I suppose when this project was set up, it was just heading into the abolition of EU milk quotas, and it was to look at something different. And is there a scope here to look at a higher output grass-based spring milk production system? So at the time when it was set up, there was a number of reasons to consider why this might be something to explore. And I think a number of those issues and concerns are even more relevant today as they were then. And we've heard about a number of them this morning already, but the main ones for that was around obviously the environmental concerns for increasing animal numbers. To increase output in a pasture-based low input system, we're looking at trying to, more land, more animals to try and increase that output. We've obviously restrictions now in relation to 2023 targets that we have from an environmental perspective, but also around our changes to our nitrates and our stocking rates. So we've lots of things here that need consideration when we're looking at what that system it could be. Another point to consider is our fragmented land base. If we need to expand, we're looking for land close to the parlour. We've also got, I suppose, limited land availability here in Ireland, as Jim alluded to earlier. On top of that then, things like our buildings, our infrastructure, having capacity for that increased performance, and obviously concerns around labour availability also. So there's lots of pieces to this puzzle and lots of factors to consider. And with those in mind, it was the basis of, can we look at something a little bit different here to explore all of our options? And this infographic just kind of explains that, because the minute you mention higher output, you think, oh, confinement, TMR, etc. But what we're looking at here is more the middle ground. We have a huge amount of valuable information and research that's been carried out here and abroad in temperate pasture-based systems. And it's not to look at the other extreme, to go to TMR feeding, etc., but it's to look at that middle ground. So what if we could increase the milk solids output on a per cow basis? What if we could maintain a very grass-focused system with moderate use of purchased feed, and then look at fertility goals as well, because obviously there's tradition for that negative correlation between milk yield and fertility. And if we were to look at that, if farmers were to consider that, what would that look like? And there wasn't really any information available for that type of system until this project. So we set out with a number of aims to develop this higher output grass-based spring milk production system. And one of the big focuses here is that we take all the advances in grassland management into that system and carry that with us. Genetics is also another really important component. We're looking for a type of cow that has good genetic merit indices for both milk production and fertility. We want to take all the best practices in relation to animal nutrition and dairy cow husbandry into this system, looking at specific nutritional studies to help refine some of that concentrate feeding element, and also looking at technologies and system attributes that will ultimately develop a sustainable higher output pasture-based spring milk production system. So the cornerstones as we see it are grassland management, genetics, husbandry and nutrition, which is not new to any of you. So this herd is run, as I said, up at the UCD Lyons Farm, which is about half an hour outside of Dublin, and it's a 58 cow herd. We run it on a 17.5 hectare milking platform and a 7 hectare outblock. And the targets that we've put in place to work towards and for this herd to achieve are outlined on this slide. So up until the end of this data covers from 2016 to 2023. So you can see our stocking rates are kind of on the old terms, and we'll take into account the reduction in stocking rate going forward. But our overall whole farm stocking rate is at 2.3. The main target we set here was around milk solids per cow, because we're trying to get increased output on a per cow basis. So our target was 625 kilos of milk solids, and that's 40% above the national average. So it's quite an increase in output. And in order to achieve that, we're looking at in around 7,500, 8,000 kilos per cow to achieve that level of output. And again, that's an increase up on compared to the national average, which is about 5,700. This is still a grass-based system, so fertility is critical. So a 6-week in calf rate of 75% is required to make sure that we're still operating a spring calving, compact calving season. But that increased output is going to need increased energy intake. So we've set a concentrate allowance here of 1,500 kilos per cow per year. And as we've seen, yes, concentrating feeding has increased in around the 1.1, 1.2 tonnes. So we're not a million miles away from that. The proportion of grass in the diet is really important. We want to make sure that we've at least 51% of the diet coming from grazed grass and at least 75% of that coming from grass and grass-fed. And as we mentioned earlier, obviously we have our grass-fed standard here where over 90% of that needs to come from grass and grass silage to be eligible for that. And this system is operating at 94% grass-fed on that basis. So our feed budget sets out the metrics of where the nutrition is coming from here. As I said, we're not looking at a complicated system. We're looking at silage, grass and concentrate. So trying to keep the system simple. And we have that, as you can see on the slide, budgeted out for the year for the lactation. And the concentrate budget doesn't change. That is our limit, 1.5, and we budget that out for where the energy is required throughout the year. So you can see there we've higher levels of feed early in lactation in the first 100 days of milk, and that tailors off then later. Another important component within the nutrition piece that we've looked at, and I won't have time to get into it today, but we've looked at the actual type of concentrate that's been fed. We've looked at reducing the crude protein of our concentrate during the main grazing season, and also looking at the use of native feed ingredients, which my colleague Michael will touch on later. So to try and summarise what we've seen over the last number of years, I've pulled this together to compare how we've managed in relation to the targets that we had set out. So in terms of our milk solids per cow per year, our target was 625 and we achieved 587 on average across those 8 years. We did exceed that, we did not achieve that target, but there was variation across the years as you would expect. But even at the 587, that's 33% above national average of where we are currently. Fertility performance was also very good, on average 77% of a 6-week in calf rate, and our concentrate budget was limited, like I said, at the 1.5 tonnes. We also achieved a proportion of grazed grass and grass silage into the system as we had set out to do. So overall we were very pleased with the performance that we achieved compared to those targets that we'd set out over the last 8 years. Which have, I suppose, been different in terms of weather, climate and things like that over that period of time. But what is the drivers behind achieving that level of performance from this higher output grass-based system? So grassland management is no doubt the cornerstone. We're not moving away from that. We're looking at our weekly measurements of grass twice weekly during the main grazing season. We're using all the tools and technologies that we have available to us to implement in relation to our spring rotation planner, using our grass wedge to manage and budget that grass that's available to those cows, and also manage our surpluses and deficits. Also using the grass wedge during the main grazing season, etc. So we're implementing all that excellent research that's been done over the years to make the most use of that most valuable resource. And what that has resulted in is achieving quite a high level of grassland performance. So on average we're growing 13 tonnes of grass. We're utilising 11.5 tonnes of that. That's a utilisation rate of on average 88% across the 8 years. So it's a high level of grass grown, but importantly a lot of that being used and utilised within that system. Our average days of grass, 263 days, achieving about 8.5 grazings per paddock across that, with a high level of grassland management between our weekly grass walks and twice weekly during the main grazing season. We'll be up on 70 grass walks in a year, just showing the importance of that and be able to manage and budget what we're achieving. We have started to incorporate white clover into the milking platform, and we've also seen a reduction in our chemical nitrogen use, and we're averaging there on the whole farm about 200 kilos of nitrogen per hectare per year. The other really important point behind this performance from this herd of cows is their genetic profile. So they are high EBI Holstein Friesian cows. But it's not just EBI that the focus is on. So EBI, we're averaging there in the most recent January 2023 evaluations was 238. But it's not just that overall EBI value, it's what's the sub-indexes, how are they balanced? We're looking for a balanced ratio between the production sub-index and the fertility sub-index. We're looking for a positive milk PTA, and we are ensuring that any of the heifers that come into this herd, we are genomically testing them and making sure they are the most superior animals coming into that herd. In relation to our breeding policy and our fertility performance, again, critical to a seasonal calving system. We're start breeding on the 1st of May. The calving rate, or the duration of the breeding season is on average around 11 weeks. We're breeding twice daily to AI, but a team of bulls is selected, and the focus there is on high milk fat and protein, high milk PTA, in addition to good health indexes and a high fertility sub-index as well. So we're really focusing on those metrics that we require for this system to make sure that we have the correct cow for the system that we're trying to evaluate. We're also using sex semen and then beef semen on some of the cows also. And you can see here from this table, it just summarises the fertility performance for the herd over the last 8 years, and we have a submission rate there, 89% this year, 6-week and calf rate percentage this year of 84%. So quite high level of performance, considering, I suppose, the high level of output that we're achieving from these cows. So from a systems perspective, and just a couple of concluding points around the kind of KPIs for the system, and that we've seen over the last 8 years that a high level of grass and performance can be achieved even in a higher output type system. We're seeing that high levels of milk output is possible from these cows that are selected on a multi-trait index for both milk and fertility. And we're also seeing a higher level of fertility performance as possible from cows that are selected on a multi-trait index for milk and fertility as well. So over the last couple of years, we've been able to look at and develop a potential blueprint for that higher output grass-based spring milk production system going forward. And what I'm going to do now at this point, I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Professor Michael Wallace, who's going to take you through the financials of the system and look at some of the environmental concerns as well. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Zoe.
So good morning, everyone. It's really great to be here at the Positive Farmers Conference this year. And as Zoe has just mentioned, I'm just going to walk you through some of the financial insights from this project and also some of the environmental considerations arising. So I think it's appropriate, though, to maybe begin by acknowledging the sceptical viewpoint on higher output, higher input systems, and I think Brendan has articulated it fairly well around the concerns about this weak association between milk yield and profitability, substitution rates, potentially walking away from high levels of grass utilisation and losing competitive advantages, along with higher additional costs that often come with feeding concentrates. So these are valid and genuine concerns, and therefore I think we have to proceed with caution. We have to proceed with in a very considered way when we're looking to increase the output potential of our system, to ensure that the extra costs are being suitably remunerated by the additional output response that can be achieved, and really management there becomes the key factor. In this context, we do recognise, as Brendan has articulated, around the move towards higher levels of concentrate supplementation nationally. On a rolling 3-year average basis, we're up around 23% since 2016, and a quarter of herds are now feeding in excess of 1.5 tonnes per cow. So there's a significant minority of farms out there that are trying to do this and trying to run higher output systems. And it's important from our point of view to understand better the types of performance factors that are going to be necessary for that to prove successful from an economic perspective. So the rationale for this has been mentioned by Zoe, so I'll not repeat the key reasons, but maybe just a comment on the final one, which I think is an important issue. We see and Brendan highlighted the huge progress that there has been in genetics, increase in milk solids per cow going from 350, as he showed, to 440 over a very short number of years with the EBI. So we've had great genetic progress. And I think to some degree there has been a response to that, realising that potential through additional supplementation potentially. And I think we are right to ask questions about how that can be done economically and in a profitable fashion. And I think when it comes to that sort of economic consideration, I think I like to go back to kind of the core principles that we often teach students around response curves. And we can think of here on this slide here 2 potential genotypes. Genotype 1 being a high-yielding type cow, which giving a high marginal response to extra concentrate feed, as you can see, versus a genotype 2, so somewhat lower yielding and lower marginal response to feed. And we believe that, and I think the project has shown that within the population of high EBI cows that we have nationally, there is certainly a subgroup of animals there that are capable of providing a really positive economic response to additional feed and give this kind of higher marginal response that's necessary. What is really key here is the type of management required, whether you're on genotype 1 and genotype 2 are very, very different. And certainly trying to feed additional supplementation to animals that have a lower potential response is going to be a fruitless exercise. So really crucial that we're working with the right cow type for this actually to work, so that we can secure a situation where the extra milk revenue generated is exceeding the additional feed costs and the ancillary costs that will come with that additional supplementation. So really strong feed efficiency is really essential. From the sort of critical performance pillars that we might see here, as I've noted here on this slide, the genetics obviously at the pinnacle here, because unless we have a cow type that's suited to this type of system, as I said, it's not going to work. We're not going to get the economic responses that we need. And there's been a lot of work within this project around selecting the right cow type for the system, looking at the sub-indices within the EBI, looking at the predicted transmitting abilities for milk production in terms of kgs, but also fat and protein, as well as fertility and health traits. So we need to get that genetics right. Secondly, we have to have the grassland management, as Zoe said. That has to be the cornerstone. We want to continue to maintain very high levels of utilisation of pasture in the system. And I think as Zoe maybe showed in that feed budget, we're looking at 3.5 tonnes of dry matter of grazed grass going into those cows. So we're getting high levels of utilisation. It's not a grass-poor system. We would argue that it's still quite a grass-rich system with high levels of grassland management. And then we're using supplementation in a strategic way, and I think it has to be economically informed, so that we are constantly evaluating, are we getting that type of response that makes this economically viable? And we also try to mitigate those additional costs. We are using a very simple feed system. All feed is being gone, all concentrate feed is going in parlour only. We're not acquiring extra machinery or equipment like diet feeders. We don't have any more expensive fodder crops like maize or whole crop or beet. We're keeping it a very, very simple system with supplementation through the parlour. That we feel is the basis for driving a competitive economic margin per hectare. And we benchmark ourselves. What we're constantly looking at is the system economically in line with the kinds of benchmarks that are established by Teagasc for a lower concentrate system. So that leads me on to the sort of this next point around the sort of system benchmarking and thinking about the how we evaluate our system. I show here on the right-hand side what I've labelled here the Lion's moderate concentrate grazing system and the kind of performance levels. These are averages over the 8 years of the trial. And then the benchmark system that I'm going to use just to highlight how this system performs against a really efficient low concentrate system. Now this is based around the Teagasc Roadmap 2027 with a somewhat higher stocking rate. Each of these systems are being operated right up or close to the maximum that is permissible under the Nitrates Directive at the sort of 2023 level, which was the 250 kg nitrogen under derogation. And I'll say more about that issue in a few moments. And the other thing, I suppose, of just simply doing the calculations, looking at our results in a simple way in terms of the incremental milk solids performance relative to the extra concentrate, we have achieved in this system very, very high rates of response to that supplementation. And certainly by other standards, 150 grams of milk solids per kg of concentrate dry matter is high. So that has to be acknowledged here, and it reflects those genetics. So then I want to sort of move on then to just look at the sort of financials a little bit more. And I suppose looking specifically at 2023, it hasn't been a kind year for any farmers or any dairy farmers because of the high input costs that have been referred to. And that is particularly true for a higher output, higher input system like the one that we have in Lyons. And so just kind of highlighting that, I mean, in this difficult year, you can see on the right-hand side the sort of comparison between the two systems. Clearly milk output has been higher, but of course direct costs have been considerably higher in that moderate concentrate system, mainly through the extra feed costs, but also AI, veterinary costs also that tend to be a bit higher with this type of system. And leaves us, if you look at it on a profit level, a bit ahead on a per cow basis, but on a per hectare basis behind where we would see our benchmark low concentrate system. So that is a real pause for thought when we look at, comparing a highly efficient, well-run, higher output system against a benchmark in this, certainly in 2023, underperformed. Some additional labour and interest costs on capital that are associated with just the nature of the kind of more intensive involvement with a moderate concentrate system. But because we have fewer cows in the system, there's certain capital and labour efficiencies there. And looking at it at the bottom line in terms of economic margin per hectare after all labour and capital related costs, the difference is about 52. So under slightly lower performance per hectare than the low concentrate system. But on a whole farm basis, if we think of maybe a typical 40 hectare farm, it's only a difference of about $2,000, which we would argue maybe isn't too bad given the year that it was. And the fact that we have 15% fewer cows in the system, which is another, I suppose, advantage. If we had to hit our milk target, milk solids, remember Zoe said of 625 kilos milk solids per cow, there would have been a profit advantage even under 2023 conditions. But it's a question of how we would consistently deliver those milk solids targets, given obviously the difficult weather conditions that we experienced in 2023. I want to just then kind of take this a little bit further to look at it maybe in a more holistic way over a number of years, because we've looked at it in a single year. If we model our performance and take account of the variation in key prices, milk, feed, fertilizer, over the last 10 years, as well as the variation that we've seen in milk yield performance that Zoe presented, what would be the kinds of distribution of performance that we would see in our system, again compared to the benchmark? So what I have here is two distributions really of economic margin per hectare. The blue line is for the low concentrate system. The red line is for the moderate concentrate grazing system. And what we have on the bottom is you can see the range in economic margin per hectare across the full set of economic conditions that we could envisage over that 10-year period. And then on the vertical axis, the cumulative probability. One thing you'll note in this here is the two curves are not that much different from each other. Very, very similar. So they have achieved similar levels of profitability performance, and indeed similar levels of risk performance as well, given high levels of management in the moderate concentrate system has mitigated risk. On the sort of midpoint, we can read across the kind of median profit per each system. Very, very similar here, around about 1,400 euros after labour and capital costs, so full economic costs deducted. So pretty good performance from both systems. You can see at the bottom end of the distribution here that the A lower concentrate system has given a higher margin. The blue line is to the right, so it's given a better performance at kind of less favourable economic conditions. And then at the upper end, you can see the red line is to the right. So when we're dealing with better milk price conditions in particular, we see a profit advantage with the higher concentrate system. The key thing is, over that sort of time period, about 80% of the time our system was delivering a margin that either matched or exceeded the low concentrate system. So we were fairly content with that, but obviously acknowledging that the level of management here is very high. There is a lot of sensitivity though, of course, and we have to acknowledge the risk factors here, particularly around milk solid yield, and indeed after milk price, the second most important risk parameter with a system like this is your milk yield, your solid yield. And we've seen quite a lot of variation in that the system is more susceptible to weather conditions, and that has to be acknowledged. So the actual risk factor of yield is as high as what we saw associated with variation in concentrate prices. So quite significant variability with respect to milk solid yields. Replacement rate, obviously very important as I show here. The need for continued focus on grassland management, absolutely crucial. And obviously the relative sensitivity to price variables, which I'll not go into given the interest of time. So overall, one would have to concede that a system of this nature, it can be profitable, but it also can be less forgiving than a low concentrate system. Just to conclude then, I'm just going to mention some of the environmental considerations. Obviously it's been referred to quite a lot about the changes in the nitrates regulations, and particularly the reduction in the organic N limit for derogation from 250 down to 220. And you can see the consequence for that. I mean, the moderate concentrate system is band 3, and we would have to reduce our stocking rate back from a maximum of 2.35 to 2.07 livestock units per hectare, and similarly the band 2 low concentrate system back from 2.71 to 2.39. So in actual fact, both systems about 12% reduction in stocking rate, which is mightn't sound like a lot, but there are obviously significant economic consequences that I'm going to come to, and I'll then turn in finally to carbon footprint after that. So let me just go back again to show that distribution of our system operating at the 250 kg nitrogen limit. So these are the two lines again, the red one for our moderate concentrate system and the blue one for the lower concentrate system. These distributions of profit. So now we're going to say, right, we're going to impose that restriction. We're going to assume that there's no extra land available just for the simplicity of this comparison. And what you can see immediately here is how those profit curves drift back. So our ability to utilize grass efficiently is dramatically reduced. So you will have heard, and particularly for people maybe from outside Ireland, realising just how significant this is for our dairy farmers, particularly those that are operating at high levels of grassland efficiency on higher stocking rates. This is enormous. You know, in terms of the median economic impact on margin per hectare, over €400 a hectare less, and both systems are being similarly impacted. So there's no get-outs that if one system is better than the other in that sense. Both have, you know, significant considerations here. Some of these effects can be mitigated, maybe by bringing in additional land, renting additional acreage, or maybe by exporting slurry. All of these options have costs, and you're basically paying money to basically continue to maintain what you have already. So they're still negative. That's the point that we're getting to. So it's hugely significant. I didn't show the 170 option. I didn't want to kind of, given that this is the Positive Farmers Conference, really to highlight anything worse, but you know, it's obviously a massive concern for us, and I suppose it's something that we can pick up in discussion. Finally, just on the carbon footprint side, what we find from our own life cycle analysis and some comparisons with Teagasc studies, and it's always difficult comparing studies, sometimes they're prepared in slightly different ways, but on balance, the system performs comparably in terms of carbon footprint. As you can see here, the red bars are kind of two comparators, one being our kind of conventional feed, which comprises imported ingredients. If we didn't have to rely on imported ingredients, and Zoe mentioned that, using a concentrate feed with native ingredients, that could reduce our footprint very significantly. But of course, the supply of native ingredients is somewhat limited. The other point to kind of note here is that, of course, these are LCA comparisons, but when we come to looking at our policy targets, they're based on a slightly different measure. They're based on territorial emissions. So there's an argument there about, well, if you're importing feed, the emissions associated with the production of that feed occurred in Argentina or Malaysia or wherever we're bringing in the ingredients actually is counted in those countries, not in Ireland. So there's a bit of an issue there of this comparison between LCA and what we're actually dealing with in a policy context with IPCC. What we find is that under IPCC, the higher output per cow certainly dilutes the emissions on that sort of convention, even after we encounter the extra feed. So just to conclude, we would argue that the types of targets that we've set for that system are challenging, but they are achievable with really good management, but it is a somewhat more complex system. Profitability can be competitive with a benchmark, efficient, low concentrate system, but more sensitive to deviations in price parameters and performance, as we've noted. So there's upside risks and there's downside risks. Very severe financial impact of nitrates degradation limit reduction, but it's not exclusive to the higher output system. Both systems that we've looked at are similarly impacted and encounter similar challenges. And finally, the moderate system, we would argue, may support efforts towards decarbonisation, certainly in terms of the policy metrics that are being used, while importantly maintaining output. So that is an important consideration here that we could bring also as part of that debate. So I'm going to leave it there.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Michael. Right, folks, we have about 20 minutes for discussion. We're going to get straight into it. I'm sure there's lots of questions in the audience. We're going to invite Lawrence Shillue to come up and join us here on the panel, and we can all have a good discussion in terms of where we are. I mean, Michael, just to summarise yourself and Zoe in terms of systems, you pushed in more concentrate. You looked at the finances. It didn't deliver in terms of margin for the farmer in the main. Over the course of the 7 years, in terms of if we're just looking at that narrow piece of margin for the farmer, didn't deliver. I mean, I'm summarising, I'm generalising, but is it fair?
I think that's taking it a bit too far. In some years, it did deliver a significant additional margin.
So, given what Jim said this morning in terms of milk price volatility and that kind of thing, and he's not predicting a positive future or whatever, he's saying, listen, it's going to be more volatile, he would suggest. I'm just trying to marry it up now and bring it into reality in terms of what the market is saying and what our processors are saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think one has to go into this with your kind of eyes open and approach it, as I said, in a very considered way. Is the additional output, and that obviously is, obviously we have to be cognizant of the milk price to concentrate price ratio, which is crucial factor in this, and certainly in 2023. That was not in our favour at all.
No.
The opposite was true in 2022 when we actually had a record year and the system absolutely performed extremely well financially by that same comparator.
Yeah.
So I think, there's a mix there of years, some years where it is outperforming, other years where it's underperforming. The important factor here to note is that on average it's delivering a similar level of margin, but it's doing so with greater variability, and you have to be able to bear that as part of this.
Okay, Lawrence, again, just to maybe kick-start the discussion piece and to get people thinking in terms of that roadmap that Michael put up in the piece in terms of the Teagasc roadmap for I think, was it 2.7 cows per hectare, whatever it was, 465 kilos of milk solids. I mean, with the new changes to the regulation, is that still the roadmap, or what parameters, or what stocking rate and what input and what milk solids can we kind of use as the roadmap for the grass-based system?
Yeah, Jack, the current roadmap sets out milk solids of 480 is our target system. What Michael took was a 2027, which is an interim target. It's 480 kilos of milk solids per cow, stocked at 2.7 livestock units per hectare, 90% 6-week calving rate. You know, those metrics. And obviously, dropping from 250 to 220 changes those numbers. Now, there's a slight bit of a tweak coming, and Brendan mentioned it on one of his slides. You know, that 92 for farmers that want to opt to use lower crude protein concentrate, that'll drop them to potentially 88, which means that target system now might be 2.55 or 2.5 to 2.55 in terms of stocking rate. So we have to set the system up to comply with policy, and that's where the system will be. So instead of it being 2.7, it'll be 2.55. Brendan showed it there in terms of the numbers. You know, we were talking about €2,450 of a net profit, including full labour costs in 2020, at a milk price of 29 cent a litre base. What we're talking about now is something very similar in terms of profit, €2,500 per hectare, but we need a milk price of 33 cent a litre base to get that milk price. So there are...
To get that net profit.
To get that net profit.
Yeah, 33 is your base, right. Okay, Mike, did you want to say something? No? 10 or 15, okay, we have the time if we need it. Excellent. Okay, right. Come on, we're open to the floor. We're open to the questions. Hands up, and we'll get them going. Keep the questions concise, and we'll get the answers. Andre down the back here straight away. Yeah. Tom, have you? Yeah. Aidan is there, right? Yeah. Oh, yeah, Aidan, you have the mic. Yeah, work with it. Yeah, straight away.
Okay. Just one, what is specific genetic merits are you looking for that'll deliver, though, that is at 150 grams milk solids for your kilo? Because that's way beyond what we see on a normal. So what are you specifically looking for? And just on Brendan, could you comment on what has led to the lower growth rates of maybe a loss of a ton of growth over the last 3 or 4 years? Is it specifically weather in the last 3 or 4 years, or is there something more to it than that?
Yeah, excellent. Two good questions. Zoe, will you take the first one in terms of the genetic piece, in terms of to deliver the extra?
Yeah, so I suppose with the genetic piece, like I said, it's not just the EBI figure we're looking for, so it's those sub-indexes. So it's getting them positive for the fat and protein, positive for PTA. So we're in the top 20% percentile for PTA for milk. And I suppose I'm not an animal breeding expert, but that will lend itself to improve response to that, is what we have seen. So it's really focusing on the PTA and getting the balance of the sub-indexes right to get that level of performance. Okay.
Anyone else want to comment on genetics?
Yeah, and just maybe for clarity, I know the response was put up there at 150 grams, but in essence, you're comparing two different cows. You know, you're comparing a national average cow versus your high EBI cow. So they're not a direct comparison in the response. You know, if you compare both of those cows with the different levels of concentrate supplementation, you'd have a different calculation. I think it'd be fair to say.
Yeah, I mean, those calculations are really just to approximate what the additional milk we're getting from the additional feed. And it's not a marginal response rate per se, because obviously that's just taking a simple 2 data points and looking at the change between them. What is, I suppose, much more tricky in any system is to actually measure the true marginal response to feed. And obviously that varies a lot from animal to animal. So we would acknowledge within our system we have cows that are producing very, very considerable responses, even in excess of what's in excess of what's reported there, versus others that are lower down. And it's a question of trying to get more of those cows that actually can express an economic response for this actually to come closer to hitting the target that we've set, because obviously we've done those calculations at 587 kilograms of milk solids. Our target has been 625. So it is a certain frustration that we're not at that. So, you know, if we were, you know, taking up kind of Lawrence's point, I mean, if we were, I suppose, comparing the systems, we should be comparing our target at 625, which we've hit a couple of years out of the 8. In fact, we've exceeded it in 1 year, versus then the kind of futuristic Moore Park system at the 480 kilograms of milk solids. So what I've tried to do is look at a kind of an average of our system against probably an efficient national
Brendan, is Aidan right? Can you get the cows to deliver this response?
So I think there's a definitional thing we have to be careful about with this. I mean, the average milk solids response to concentrate on Irish farms is 55 grams per kilo of extra concentrate. The 150 grams figure is when you compare it at the two systems levels, where we've taken a system with a higher stocking rate, a higher milk yield per cow, a higher level supplement, and we've got the multiplier effect of stocking rate and the milk production per cow, and that's where the 150 grams comes from. But I would argue that a lot of that is attributed to the stocking rate rather than to the actual PD of the milk yield of the cow. You know what I mean? So, no, but that's just a definitional thing, right?
Exactly,
So that's at one level. Look, I think for most farmers still, and I think we need to go back and look at fertility performance on farms. We brought in new technologies now in semen and so on. We need to revisit these things. For most farmers, getting to a mature age structure with higher EBI animals, 60% of them at third and greater lactation in the herd, and bringing that replacement rate back down to 18%, and the costs associated with that now would be far more beneficial in terms of getting the milk on the positive side and the cost on the other side down, and the revenue or the profit. For me,
fertility delivering the milk solid.
And we're dealing with two herds here, and I've nothing but admiration for the system the lads have shown. They're both plus to 100 kilos of fertility sub-index. I mean, they're hitting all the targets of grassland and fertility. So the building blocks here are identical. There's a specific question around a higher concentrate supplementation rate, which I don't want to cloud it with the other attributes that they have delivered in the system.
Okay, Aidan, second question. Grass, why are we growing less? Is it less bag? Is it weather? Is it what is it?
And if you could answer that question, Lawrence, you're supposed to be answering the questions on this. But look, to be serious about it, I think it's an amalgam of those. At one level, we had 2018 was an extremely dry year on grassland farms, and since then we've had 2 or 3 years of average rainfall, and that certainly has impeded grass growth on a large number of dairy farms. So at one element there's been a restriction of moisture, in particular on drier farms, that has never properly, I don't think we've got the resaturation of those soils. And one of the benefits of the year we've just had of plus 200 mils of rain on average is that I expect to see a much better grass growth recovery on farms in the next year compared to what we've had. So there's an element of that. There's an element of grazing management practices I think have slid a little bit. I mean, we did an exercise in the autumn just looking at measurement on farms, and out of 15,000 dairy farmers that Jim mentioned, there was 750 farms that had done 30 covers at the end of last year. That's a fair indictment of us around grazing and management. So there's a second element there. And the third element then is in terms of the move to clover systems. And I don't think you could chastise Irish dairy farmers for not being enthusiastic about getting clover in and trying to do it. But they have to be pragmatic about it. And if there isn't clover in there, we're restricting nitrogen use. So if there are pastures there that do not have clover in them, or have very low clover contents, we need to use chemical fertilizer to grow grass in those situations. And in some cases, you would look back and, visiting farms and groups and so on, we've got back down to 200 or less kilos of N spread per hectare, but we haven't got the clover.
Haven't grown the grass.
So there's a combination of those factors.
Yeah. Okay, Aidan, I think we've given it a good time. Weather management in the clover bag. Aidan, are you happy? Lawrence, nothing to add to that,
Maybe the only other one to add in is P&K level reduction in purchases is huge as well. So that's feeding into it as well,
Cost piece margin, farmer skimping on the P&K. Tom, with you, Andre,
just wondering, your structure on feeding the concentrate through that time seemed very rigid. In the real world scenario, would it be more likely that people would feed the concentrate at a different time, like the variability in the pasture growth showed, there's more variability there than in your meal feeding? So if somebody were to go down this foolish route of feeding 1.5 tonne of meal, would they feed it differently, and would you be more likely to achieve your 625 kilos of milk solids target?
Okay, excellent. So, Michael, Zoe, in terms of the timing of input of putting in that concentrate, you're putting in 6, 7, 8 kilos early in lactation. I think there's 700 or 800 kilos per cow gone in before day 120. Andre is saying be more strategic. If you have the grass, let the grass be there and let feed them. But if you have a gap, feed the concentrate then and get your better response.
Yeah, no, this is the approach that we've taken was to look at this is our budget. Like I said, the 150 doesn't change. That is our target of where we think based on the performance, the expected milk yield, expected performance of grass that we've grown, where we would need that energy at those time of the year. That's not to say that, you could change it. We've toyed the idea in the future, maybe looking at, feed to yield and as opposed to that kind of blanket rate. But I suppose the other thing to say is that we're also monitoring body condition score, etc. as we go, and we're monitoring the energy requirements versus the energy supply throughout the project as well. So we're watching that. So if, for example, there last year, we had some drought, we did have to increase the budget by a kilo, and we lost it later on by a kilo as well. So there is that kind of small management there that we definitely take into account when the time is needed. But we are, I suppose, blanket feeding the herd as opposed to feed to yield for the time being. But we have further funding for the next couple of years, and we've definitely talked about that being an option to see, what effect that would have on the performance of the herd as well. So yeah, it's a good point.
Okay, excellent, thank you.
Thank you.
Next question, yeah.
I just have, first to say thanks for a fantastic session. It's great to have all that information put forward for everyone. The first question I have is just around the UCD farm systems and achieving high 70s in conception rate for service over the last 4 years is unbelievable. And what do you put that down to?
Yeah, so I suppose the management around that is really important. So starting at the breeding season, like I mentioned the breeding obviously in terms of the genetics, but pre-breed scan, going in there on the 1st of May, we are using scratch cards and there's visual assessment there as well as a heat detection method. So I suppose when maybe Michael mentioned there might be a slight increase in labour there, but it's pinpointing those cows, getting them on time. The poor performance in the earlier years, we were just on once a day AI, as was farm practice at the time. That has changed, that has helped to improve that as well. But I suppose for ourselves, we're incredibly pleased to see that level of performance. Like we were, you questioned at the start whether you would achieve that or not, but the fact that we have gotten that and those cows are going back in calf so quickly has been a real
the pre-breeding scan, in terms of, is there a lot of input going in then, as based on the results of the pre-breeding scan? Is there a lot of drugs going in or a lot of synchronization, or what's
no, within normal levels. And then after that, like there's I suppose with the heifers as well, we have a synchronization plan that goes in place with the heifers. It'll be an additional thing that we do also. But like within that, we're breeding like those conception rates, like that's the sex semen on the maiden heifers. We also this year went with sex semen on the first lactation cows and 6 elite cows as well that we want to retain the genetics from. So there is, I suppose, a bit of management there around the breeding, but it's nothing, I suppose, over and beyond what we would expect from our very high efficient producers nationally to be at least trying to achieve and trying to implement on farm.
Gillian, yeah.
Just a second question there is how much of a factor is weather extremes, especially where you're based in the country and it's getting, with these dry spells, prolonged dry spells being a huge factor in grassland production over the summer months. How big of a factor is that in your plans over the next 10 years for risk management?
Yeah. So I suppose just from a line system perspective, I suppose, as we kind of mentioned at the start, that the limitation for our project is it's one site in one location. And I suppose Lyons is typically quite a dry farm, so we have seen that impact, particularly in the last 3 years.
Like just explain for the over 700, 800 mils is probably, is it? Or is it
our average would be 800 mils now, kind of over the last 10 years, and we're probably back a little bit on that in the last couple of years, it'll be to the kind of closer to 700. So we are back in that, resulting in some soil moisture deficit. So we've seen that, like if we look at our range in grass grown over the last couple of years, we're going from 14 tonne 1 year to just hitting 11 tonnes there last year. So there is huge variation within that, and it's the management of that. But I suppose that's applicable to a lot of people. A lot of farms will be in the same situation, but it has had quite an impact. And again, that's a limitation to one site study that we are seeing the response and the performance of the cows and the performance of the herd based on that element.
Gillian, were you asking, is there anything they're going to do to manage that risk? Is that where we're coming from?
I know, just seeing is it a considerable factor to put into, say, economic analysis or risk analysis over the next 10 years?
Michael, how to allow for that, or...
Well, essentially, that's what we have done in those calculations. So I've used the data that we've gathered on from the systems trial to actually model that variation that we've experienced in animal performance. So that's actually been included in there, and those distributions, it's a factor. What I haven't been able to do is do a kind of similar assessment of how variable the performance would be in the lower concentrate system. So I would suspect that there's going to be some effect there, but that's essentially been locked in. So we're essentially capturing the kind of risk on the moderate system while not doing so on the lower concentrate system. And I think we need to maybe evaluate that more to actually understand the kind of sources of resilience in both systems and how we manage weather events better.